Good evening, and thank you, Professor Kumaran, for those generous words of introduction and for this excellent opportunity. Archaeologists rarely visit the IIT, and rarer so they are invited by an IIT to speak. So I'm doubly happy, jubilant, and proud of it. Of course, he read out my bio. I could have added one more thing to reinforce my links with this IIT. I was an alumni of the Kendriya Vidyalaya just diagonally opposite. So that was my closest link to IIT, but I've got many of my uncles, cousins, others who are all products of IIT and who are spread all over. So we have been discussing about today's talk for quite some time and various topics. Then I suggested this and he readily agreed. I would say gone are the days when science and humanities were considered as two distinct watertight compartments poles apart. People specializing in one would hardly look at the other. Gone are those days. At all levels, the artificial barriers between science and arts is breaking and has almost broken down. These are days of interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary studies the world over. And archaeology occupies a special place among humanities disciplines. There have been debates for the last 100 years or more, ever since archaeology as a modern science began to be taught in universities everywhere, including India. And even in university question papers, we were often asked that essay-type question to answer, is archaeology an art or a science? Often the answer is it's both. It's partially an art, it's partially a humanities subject, and partially a scientific discipline. And today's talk may give you some more idea on this, of what is archaeology and how increasingly it is becoming a science discipline. And we have always been relying on science and technology. If I can add so, even some of the researchers of IIT to further our own discipline, and that trend is continuing. Yeah. So I've made, because much of my research for today's talk was in the US, and many of you would be familiar with the academic scenario in US. So I thought I'll begin, and some of the case studies I'm presenting, because just saying archaeology and science are merging, it would be better if I'm illustrating it with some colorful, down-to-earth case studies or examples. And I have drawn some examples from 3 countries, USA, India, and Cambodia. And all the examples I'm giving are those in which either I was part of it or I have done an in-depth study or research on it. So before that, more in the nature of an introduction. When I say US, it's basically the West, the Canada and US and adjoining countries. But India and UK and Europe is quite different in this matter. Just like our healthcare system, our government system, and so many of our modern institutions like the railways, postal department, they are all the creation of the British, as we all know, due to historical reasons. They were ruling us, and when modern development came, they were in the forefront. The archaeology system, the very concept and approach to the subject, and the archaeology administration in India was initiated by the British, and it's on the British model, almost totally different from the American one. So now coming to India, just to have some fascinating foundation information on archaeology. We study basically prehistoric archaeology. You all know what it is, Stone Age. Protohistoric is between the Stone Age and historic. Man, in prehistoric, no writing, man was illiterate. He was almost an animal, slowly trying to walk. Protohistoric is a transition period where writing was slowly developed. And the most famous civilization in this part of the world we study under that is the Harappan or Indus Valley civilization, which was contemporary to and had trade and cultural links with three more civilizations, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Chinese. And then we have early historical archaeology, which stretches from around 300 BCE to 200 or 300 CE. And then, of course, medieval archaeology, which is later. But for various reasons, somehow we give over importance to prehistoric and early historical archaeology at the cost of medieval archaeology, because we have so much rich wealth, even of the very remote past. Almost the whole of India was occupied by prehistoric man, right? From Delhi, the capital city, parts of Delhi, we have found prehistoric relics. And more interesting, right in our own backyard, in Keelpok, in Pallavaram, in Athirambakam, in and around Chennai, we have found Stone Age tools. Then in US, it's totally different. They do have prehistoric archaeology. Stone Age man lived everywhere. But then they don't study the very concept of protohistoric is not there, or even early historical. Anything after prehistoric down to the medieval or even colonial times is just one thing for them, historical archaeology. Then more interesting, they study certain things which we never do in India or in this part of the world, in the whole of South Asia. Commercial archaeology, study of the relics of ancient, or even for them it's ancient, for us it may seem modern, things a few hundred years ago, commercial things like hotels, restaurants, motels, gas stations, relics of those things. Industrial archaeology, the evolution of industries and engineering skills over the ages. And then, of course, landscape archaeology, more to do with the contours of the landscape, even layout of roads, and also natural contours, water bodies, and so on. And this landscape archaeology has a lot to do with landscape architecture, which is becoming a very popular discipline these days. And finally, conservation archaeology, which is basically what they say minimal digging. Archaeology, as you all know, involves excavating Mother Earth. But in US, they believe that digging is a destructive process and an irretrievable one at that. Once you dig the site fully, with some technique or tools, after a few years or a few generations, you may evolve better tools and better techniques of digging, but then you can't utilize them if the site is fully dug up. And so it's minimal digging, and they try to have other ways of learning about the site, like remote sensing, magnetic sensing, and other things, and do digging only partially, even if they have the time, resources, and technical know-how to do the complete digs. It's postponed or kept for future generations who may be able to dig better. But that concept is totally absent in India. We postpone or cancel digging due to lack of financial resources or technical manpower, but not for conserving the site for future digging. And in India abounds in archaeological sites that till now we have never considered it to be a non-renewable resource. We take it for granted. That's the scenario here. Then, of course, there are two sub-disciplines of archaeology which are common to both the West and India. rescue or salvage archaeology, which they do a lot, even before even a big housing complex or a small mini township or a gated community or a dam or a reservoir or anything which involves digging, if it comes up, an archaeologist has to be in the site to see that no archaeology is getting destroyed in that process. And if at all they find something interesting, the digs have to be stopped by the real estate company or the government, whoever it may be. And the archaeologists may do a fast digging on priority basis, and after he has recovered the antiquities or studied the site to his satisfaction and certifies that the site can be used for modern development, only then the construction can restart again. But in India, we have no such rule or procedures. People in all departments dig, and many things have got lost and spoiled. But then the laws are yet to be tightened on those front. But one famous example of salvage or rescue archaeology was in Nagarjuna, where they wanted to build a dam across the river Krishna, and that site was earlier identified in the pre-independence era. And when the government in the early years of independence, 1950s, wanted to build the dam, archaeologists knew the entire site will be submerged under the dam. So the department was given 5-6 years that they can excavate completely, relocate the artifacts recovered to a higher level, safer place away from the waters of the dam. It was done, and today the site is submerged, but most of the relics have been located to a neighboring site away from the dam. So that's the most famous example of salvage archaeology in India, but it takes place more in US. It has also taken place to a considerable extent in Egypt. And another one, very new subdiscipline is underwater or marine archaeology, which again, India is yet to sign the Marine Archaeology Convention of UNESCO for various reasons. We know what it is. There are a few experts who can dive into the ocean and explore, but still we are lacking a lot in terms of scientific expertise and technical manpower for this subject, although India has a very long coastline, one of the longest in the world, both on the east and the west. And we have had a long history of maritime trade, and our coastline is dotted with shipwrecks and other underwater relics. And there's much to explore. Some attempt was made at Dwaraka in Gujarat and even Kaveripatnam and Mahabalipuram nearer Po, but much more needs to be done. Now, coming to the historical evolution, the way the archaeology subject developed, it was the era of kings and nobles till 1800. If the king wanted to preserve an old building or undertake a study of the past, he could do it. If he was adamant in destroying it, people had no say in it. Then, of course, it was the era of the colonial powers when government departments began. The Archaeological Survey of India in 1861, the National Park Service in US, its counterpart in the US in 1916, all over. And ours was based on the British model, not on the American model. And we progressed more after 1947. Of course, we have still retained the British model. Even the study of archaeology, what we study here is more on what they study in Cambridge at Oxford and not what they study in Harvard or Princeton. Yeah. Now in US, just to strike the comparison for you, again it's almost the same but with some more historical difference. It was an era of random voluntary efforts till their independence. Lot of these did take place and attempts to preserve the relics of the past, and more systematic ones after their independence in 1776. And then coming to what is there in India, the administration part, the highest authority in India for all archaeological operations, excavations, explorations, underwater or on the land, underground archaeology or above ground archaeology, historic preservation of artifacts, buildings, sites, graves, whatever, highest authority to do it. And if others want to do it, they have to get a license or approval from the ASI. And then every state of India, Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, everyone have their own state departments of archaeology, sometimes clubbed with the Department of Zoo and or museums and or archives. Sometimes these are all separate since they are all interconnected. In some states like Kerala, it's Department of Archaeology, museums and zoos. And sometimes even archives is clubbed with it. And the last one is a new trend. We have voluntary organizations. They are more in UK and US, less in India, but we do have even national level organizations like INTAC who are chipping in to supplement the role of the government in archaeology. Yeah. Now coming to the US part, again, it's what is ASI for us? It's the National Park Service for them, the highest authority to take care of the most prestigious and imported buildings and sites all over US. Then again, at the state and city and district level, they have, each state has its own laws, state level laws and departments. Then of course, they have more voluntary agencies. What is intact? Now every country has a national level trust. It's like private enterprise in archaeology, if I can put it, like a government college, government school, private school, government hospital, private one. Each has its plus and minuses. Still recently, private enterprise in archaeology was not thought of. Now it's catching up. And England, UK was the first country to have the English National Trust as early as the 1880s, 1883. And America's National Trust, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, NTHP, headquartered in DC, where I was a Fulbright Fellow, that was started in 1949. And India's National Trust, INTAC, with its nationwide network of chapters, supplementing the role of the government at the voluntary level, started in 1984. Now, some pictures. I was told which department visited Arikamedu. Your professor told me some students went to Arikamedu. Okay, they are not here. This is Arikamedu because I'm happy that some students here went there because in India, that's one more difference, I would say, between the Indian and the Western thing. There, they excavate more of sites, even World War II sites, colonial period sites. We have those sites, but since we have so much of rich archaeological wealth of a previous earlier period, we focus more on that. And so the end result is there they excavate even within cities. Right on the road, here you see people digging, but it's not archaeological digs, it's for something else. But there, even in the middle of Washington, DC or Boston, or even in a big city like Sacramento, you would see an archaeological dig going on. Or big state place close to the cities that makes people understand archaeology better, even for the layman. He sees archaeologists at work. In India, it's very difficult to do that. Our sites are deep within forests where archaeologists camp for weeks or months, living prehistoric life with no internet or mobile network facilities, cooking basic meals, and so on. And so the nearest archaeological site, if any tourist, a serious tourist or a student or anyone wants to see, it's difficult from any city. But now we have identified a few. If you come to Delhi, where I am now on this new assignment, Rakigari, which is now on the news as a Harappan site, close a 3-hour drive from Delhi, is close enough to drive and see within a day or two. And Arikamedu is the nearest site for us in Chennai to go and see a real archaeological site. It's just beyond Pondicherry, between Pondicherry and Kadalur. It is It was a Roman site, a Roman port of call. 2000 years ago, we have recovered Roman artifacts. It enjoys many other firsts to its credit. It is a site which has been repeatedly excavated by archaeologists of different nationalities. French, because it was Vidit Pondicherry, their colony, they were the first to identify or recognize its archaeology potential and dig. Then the British dug it even when it was under French rule, with French permission, and then the Indian teams excavated, and more recently, 1989 to 91, a team from the University of Pennsylvania collaborated with the University of Madras team and did dates. This is Kodumanal near E Road, again a very important site of that period. Inland, Aritamedu is a coastal site. This is right in the midpoint, almost between the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal. Next. Again, another view of Kodumanal. This is, we are from sites, we have jumped to monuments. This is the Vaikunta Perumal temple in Kanchipuram and the Shore temple in Mahabalipuram. Here we have had some, now I'm coming to the subject proper, the core subject, the use of technology. I thought I'll put up some sites and monuments which have been a real challenge from the archaeology perspective and how we have overcome those challenges thanks to modern technology. Shore temple, which I'm sure many of you would have visited, you're familiar with it. It is a very good temple built of granite. They say the foundation goes up to the bedrock, therefore the structural stability is good despite its being exposed to the ocean winds and the ocean waves and even multiple tsunamis, the latest one being 2004. Even that tsunami, though it destroyed a lot of things on this coastal stretch, water entered the Shore temple, receded after a few hours, but the temple was intact. But then it faces certain peculiar problems for the archaeologists. The salt-laden sea winds are eroding the finer details of the sculptures on the wall. The wall is built of stone blocks with no plastering material. The blocks laid one above the other, and most of the blocks are beautifully carved or sculpted, but the sculptures have become worn out. Mainly, even it's actually three temples, as you know, one facing east, and the other behind it again facing east, and the one facing west. The two temples which are away from the ocean have suffered minimal impairment or negligible impairment because they are away from the ocean winds. The easternmost temple facing the Bay of Bengal has borne the brunt of the destruction, and even the Shivalika in the sanctum has broken more than halfway through and it's no longer in worship. And now over the last 100 years, several attempts were made how to arrest this deterioration. And the latest, as one of the major attempts has been what they say the paper pulp technique of trying to put paper pulp on it, and the paper pulp absorbs the salt. But it's a very laborious, time-consuming process, very difficult to undertake in a site which attracts hundreds of tourists every year, a World Heritage Monument where you can't close the site, restrict tourism even for a day. All the 365 days it's kept open, so that's the big challenge. And other attempts have also been made of trying to have some vegetation cover, casuarina plantations and such things to break the speed of the salt-laden sea waves. But as you know, they are all temporary measures, effective to an extent. The problem continues and more efforts are being made to resolve it. Now we are coming to more interesting examples. It's a small question for the people here. Anyone? I'm sure you can recognize what building this is. Yeah, it's the DGP office on the marina. Now, why I put it here to share a small interesting secret, not many may know. Some of you, if you can recall, it happened more than 30 years ago. This building, to tell you its very likely history, it was built around the time when the White House was built in the US. And some old tourist brochures even call this the White House of Chennai. It shares certain architectural similarities with the White House and the date and, of course, the white color. Beyond that, the similarities stop. Anyway, it was built as a Masonic lodge and was owned by the Freemasons, who later rented it to the police department in the early 19th century. And later the police department purchased it from the Freemasons, expanded it and settled here, and it continues to be the police headquarters. In the early 90s, the police suddenly decided that they needed a bigger space, office space, and they initiated a plan to break this building and build a multi-story skyscraper at the site. At that time, awareness of heritage and the sensitivity for heritage was much less, early 1990s. And so the police went, and there were no laws at any level. Even now, laws are few, but there are at least some rules and guidelines for heritage structures. But 1990s, there were none. And there was no one to oppose it. But intact, the National Trust, which was just at that time started in 1984 in Delhi, it had already taken roots in Chennai. The Chennai or Tamil Nadu state chapter is one of the oldest. The only way was to go to the court to appeal to the court in public interest that this heritage structure be saved, because appeals to the owners who did not heed the result. And so Intact went to court. It was one of those early days when Intact did it hesitatingly. Intact itself was not well known, and it had very limited resources and manpower. But Intact went to court, and the Madras High Court ruled in favor of Intact and heritage, and the building was saved at the nick of the moment. Even a few days of delay, we may have lost the building, and the police later had to obey the court verdict, and they restored it, and it is still in good use without being turned into a modern building. And we in Intact sometimes pride ourselves that of all the government departments, we fought with the police department and we won, and the police costs. Anyway, to strike a similar example, a case study in the US. Yeah. Now, this again, many of you may have been to the US, and I can even give you a closer thing. If you've been to New York, can you recognize this? Anyone? New York. It's the Grand Central Station. And the Grand Central Station there, it has a lot of historic association. It's a heritage building. Why I'm putting this DGP office and the Grand Central next to each other in the slides is that it has a similar history, but that took place more than 20 years before 1990s, early 1970s. This Grand Central Station was owned, it was not owned by the government, it was owned by a private entrepreneur who was running the station and some of the railway lines and some of the railways also operating from it. As you know, it's a big hub. Apart from its being a railway station, as in the US, it has a large commercial concourse and many other things, shops, cafeterias, many things. And he suddenly felt that the railway lines were running at a loss, and he wanted to change this property and again wanted to build a skyscraper there. And right in the heart of the city as the station is located. And again, at that time, there was, even in the US, the laws were, US has more stringent laws for heritage than India. But still, late 60s, early 70s, heritage awareness was not as strong even in the US as in India. And people were afraid. One was the heritage part. The building's heritage value would be lost forever if he does what he wants to do. And secondly, this being in the heart of the city, in a very already a crowded area, it may have lot of practical implications in terms of car parking, crowds, noise pollution, other types of pollution, and so on. And again, the American National Trust and a few other voluntary agencies, they went to the court in US for judicial intervention. And again, happily, the verdict came in favor, because his argument was, it is his building, his land, and he can build up to the sky. But then the court said, it is his property, but there are restrictions with regard to pollution and environmental factors and the neighborhood in which the property is located. And so he was not allowed to build, and the Grand Central Station has survived thanks to the American National Trust. Again, other views, a night view of the same American the station. Okay, yeah, it's inside the station, one of the commercial areas. Yeah. This again, you will know what it is. The Senate House of the University of Madras, designed by Robert Fellows Chisholm, a famous British architect of the 19th century, who designed many public buildings almost all over India, in different parts of the country. This was chosen by an open competition in which his design won the prize. He has also designed the Presidency College and very many buildings in Chennai. He was partially responsible even for the Madras High Court. He has designed some buildings even in the Nilgiris and North India, but Chennai has a large chunk of his designs. And the Senate House was one of his favorite projects, built between 1872 and 80, and it is what we call the Indo-Saracenic style of architecture, an amalgam of the British or colonial, the native Indian or Hindu, and the Islamic styles. And the Indo-Saracenic, one of its features, not necessarily, but mostly it has what we call exposed brickwork. The brick wall is not plastered or painted, at least from outside, and it served as the convocation hall of the newly formed Madras University, started in 1857, which, as you all know, was one of the three oldest universities of India, the other two being Bombay and Calcutta. And for many decades, it served as a convocation hall and then even as an examination hall. And several luminaries have got their degrees and or written their examinations within this hall. But somehow after the 1970s and 80s, it fell in disuse. It was not properly used. And the university had its convocations in a more spacious and a modern hall with better facilities. And then there was a need to restore it, to save it for its heritage value. And the university agreed. Finance was an issue, but then they said they'll tap the alumni. And as you all know, Madras University's bright alumni are spread all over the world, with a majority chunked in the US. And so the alumni pooled in their resources, and the INTAC, in collaboration, technical collaboration with L&T, restored the building in around 2006-2007. And the then President of India, Abdul Kalam, came and inaugurated the restored building. So it's again one of the rare instances of a voluntary organization given an opportunity and doing an excellent work of restoring a government heritage building. And now INTAC is in the process of restoring the GPO further down in North Madras, and also the Southern Railway Headquarters building next to the Chennai Central Railway Station. Yeah, now is going to be the high point of today's talk. It's almost the final part, but the most last, but not the last. It's the second last, but nonetheless not the least. You all know this big temple of Tanjore, the Bridishwara temple, a World Heritage Monument, and known for its history, art, architecture, whatnot. And today what I'm going to stress is it has also been a major challenge for conservation for the archaeologists right from the late 19th century when it was taken over by the Archaeological Survey. And that is what not many people know. Apart from the problems that it faced like all other monuments, growth of vegetation, water seepage, water rising from the floor due to capillary action, and so many other things, it has certain peculiar other things which many people may not know of. This is a ground plan of the temple, the main shrine, all the sub-shrines. It has been patronized by royal dynasties throughout. It was built, as you know, by the Chola King Rajaraja in the early 11th century. Its 1000th anniversary was also celebrated a few years ago. But today's focus is right in the main shrine, which many of you would have visited. Not many would know. This is the main sanctum, which is very dark inside, as you know. You approach it through a series of halls. Like many other old temples, but today they are not open to public, unfortunately, because many temples have what we call a narrow, completely closed circumambulatory passage, Pradakshina Pada, and that was the norm those days. Most temples have it. But today, in most of the ancient temples, they don't allow us because crowds have increased and the passages are too narrow and dark. And in the interest of security, that there should not be a stampede or an accident, they have just closed the passage or sometimes open it for restricted access during festivals. The Kailasnatha temple of Kachipuram, many other temples have it, but not open to public. This big temple of Tanjore also has one such passage. And if you had gone up to this point, up to which alone we can go, you could see two tight-fitting doors, one here, one there, facing each other. It's because we are not allowed to go any further. And when the temple was built, people were allowed to go. This numbering has been done by modern-day archaeologists. The people would enter, it has to be clockwise, through this chamber one, and this is east. They will go through the south wall, west wall, north wall, and exit through this. And each of these chambers of the four sides were divided into, the corridor was divided into chambers, which modern-day archaeologists, for the sake of research and convenience, have numbered it from 1 to 50. And the chambers are divided by pillars and pilasters, which we believe engineering requirements of structural stability led to the creation of these chambers. But more interesting and crucial, the chambers right from the ceiling and on the walls up to the floor were covered with paintings by the Cholas. Paintings mostly religious, and even a rare painting of Rajaraja himself with his guru or preceptor Kalur, they were in one chamber. And these paintings were there and people were going around it. But due to the constant lighting of oil lamps and the frequent burning of camphor in and outside the sanctum, the paintings did suffer damage. And within 300-400 years, by the 15th century, many of the paintings had almost gone or had deteriorated beyond repair. By that time, a new dynasty, the Nayaks, had taken over, and in the ignorant of any other more effective scientific ways of preserving the existing flaking paintings, they decided to paint over it. And the Cholas, when they painted it, it was granite stone, uneven surface, on which they put lime plaster. It was lime basically, but it had sand also, and iron and magnesium in traces. and they did it in 2 layers. Total thickness is around 2.6 inches. It was done 1.8 inches at another 0.8 inches with sand as the inert material. The amount of sand in the lower layer was greater, and in the upper layer it was less to make the upper layer smoother. And on that they painted. One important information, I'll just reserve it after a few minutes. That's the most dramatic one. Now, coming to the Nayaks, once this paint deteriorated, the Nayaks put a fresh plaster over it, again lined, again graded. But the Nayak plaster was not as good in quality as the earlier Chora plaster, and all that the Nayaks painted. And people continued to use it. And many did not even know that the wall had 2 layers of painting sticking to each other, painting hiding behind painting. Centuries passed. By 1930, at one time in the 18th, 19th century, during the Anglo-French rivalry, this temple itself became a military hideout. Worship stopped. Even the priest had to flee away. It was a frightening scenario. And both the French and the British, they say, hid within this painted corridor next to the sanctum. And the painting suffered irreparable damage. And after that, the temple was restored by the local Maratha king, a purification ceremony performed, and worship revived. And for some time, during this time, the passage was kept closed, but then again it was reopened for devotees. And 1931, a professor from the Annamalai University, Chidambaram, along with a group of his students, came to this temple on a study tour, and they went round this passage. And they say as they went round, they were going around this passage and trying to see and admire and enjoy these paintings, and something fell on their head like a shower of fragments, to quote the original report, some powder. They thought naturally that they panicked. The wall is falling or something from the roof. They ran, and others also ran. But later they found it was only the old flaking painting fragments which had fallen. But then this Professor Govindaswamy noticed something. He saw that the painting panel was falling, but a new layer of painting was peeping out of the gaps formed by the fallen paint. And it was he who, for the first time, accidentally, it was like so many archaeological and other discoveries all over the world, it was a sheer chance or accident that he noticed there is an inner layer of painting hidden behind the outer layer. The newspaper reports, Hindu and others carried long reports on it the next day. All this happened around 1931. And the news reached the archaeology department in Delhi, and they identified a chemist from the Madras Museum, a famous one at those days, Dr. Paramashivam, who had done a chemical analysis of the paintings in Ajanta, Ellora, Sittanavashal, and many other places. He did a painstaking study of these paintings, and his report was published in the US in 1938. And after that, a complex process of restoring these paintings started. Now to what I promised you, the real dramatic part. This is the black and white, next one. The color one, the famous painting. There are many paintings. Some of them are just patches of color. This one is famous and put in many books. This is Rajaraja, the majestic kingly figure, the only Lomo, one of the few. We take it authentic because it was done in his lifetime with his guru or preceptor Karur Deva. And these are other paintings on those walls. And of course, this I've already told you, the constituents of the plaster of the Chora painting, and then how they got the pigments. It's sort of a myth that they didn't know chemistry or they used only vegetable dyes and so on. They did use vegetable dyes, but most of the colors the chemists have certified were of mineral origin. Even the black was manganese dioxide. And now comes the most important part. It's fresco painting, the only known fresco in the whole of India, true fresco. As many of you would know, fresco painting or true fresco means painting on wet plaster, which means you have to paint when the wall plaster is laid. The mason and the artist have to work closely together. The mason would lay the plaster, and whether it's lime plaster, mud plaster, or today's concrete or cement plaster, it may take anywhere from 4 to 6 hours to 20 hours to dry. And within those hours, the artist has to execute the painting on the wet plaster. So it was a real challenge. And in many places, what was suspected as true fresco painting, later archaeochemical analysis of those paintings have proved they are not true fresco. But this one, first studied by Paramashivam and by other scientists much later, it is true fresco. And one more thing, why this is not Tanjore, it's the Sistine Chapel in Rome. In true fresco, what major disadvantages, if you have to paint a whole wall, you cannot normally paint it within that few hours, a big wall. But there are ways to do it. Either the mason does the plastering of one part of the wall today, and you ask the artist to paint it today or early morning tomorrow, and tomorrow he would lay the plaster for the other part of the wall, and then that would get painted and so on. In that case, you will definitely see some sort of a plaster, a mark, a line which you distinguish even after hundreds of years that the plastering was done in stages. Aesthetically and from the perspective of art history, it's not a very skilled technique. Otherwise, if you want to circumvent this or overcome this, the only way would be you have an army of artists, a big team ready with the theme of the painting, the paint, pigments, brushes, color, everything, all infrastructure ready. And once the masons lay the plaster of the entire wall, you divide the wall into different sections and put all the teams to work separately, that the entire wall painting is completed within those few hours on the wet plaster. So in the Sistine Chapel and most of the other frescoes all over the world, right in Washington, D.C., on the dome, inside dome or cupola of the Capitol, their Senate, you have fresco paintings. In Philadelphia and elsewhere in some churches, you have fresco paintings. Of course, the largest number are in the medieval churches in Europe. In most of these churches, can you see there's a line mark there? One can see, if one observes very carefully, that the plaster was done in different parts of the same wall on different days, and the painting was done in stages, and which is not aesthetically pleasing. But in Tanjavur alone, the fresco, we do not see such line marks between one panel and the other. So either they had an army of artists to do the entire wall on a single day, or else they did it in patches, but then they intelligently put those line marks or demarcation marks in the border decoration between the patches. The lines are below the border. Either way, it speaks volumes in praise of the Tanjore artist, and art historians have rightly hailed as the Tanjore frescoes as one of the best executed frescoes in the whole world. Now, if the story of the execution of these paintings is so dramatic, its conservation after 1931 is equally an interesting story, both of human interest and scientific interest. A color photograph of that chamber and the sanctum. Now finish the passage, and now comes the major part. After India got independence, they decided that Chora frescoes have to be exposed. And because we do not have specimens of Chora paintings in any other temples. But the problem was they were covered with a Nayak painting on the top, the 10th century painting hidden by the 16th or 15th century painting. In the initial years, they did not know of any other better method except slowly scrapping off the Nayak painting. It was a destructive method. But the archaeologists justified this destruction ground that Nayak paintings are found in many temples, but Chora paintings are not there anywhere. So quite a few walls, the Nayak painting was carefully chipped off and the Chora painting exposed. Of course, there were some walls in which below the Nayak painting there was no Chora painting, obviously indicating that the entire Chora painting had fallen off or was destroyed even before these 15th century rulers repainted on those walls. Then in the early 1970s, there was a growing awareness that the Nayak paintings, which are themselves around 400 years old, should not be destroyed in this way just to reveal the underlying Chora painting. Which means we would have to find a technique in which we are able to detach the Nayak painting without destroying them, and also in the process expose the Chora painting below the Nayak painting on the same wall. Much research was done and consultations held with archaeologists and scientists all over the world. In Italy, they said they've even removed wall plaster from one building with the painting on it and put it on another building. Closer home, a famous scholar called Aurel Stein, he used to cut off fragments of rocks or paintings from walls and rocks and gifted it to India, and they are still in the National Museum. So such transplantation of paintings was not uncommon, but one major issue was in all those cases the walls or rocks had only one layer of painting, unlike Tanjavur where two layers of painting were sticking to each other. Finally, thanks to the ingenuity of the experts from the Archaeological Survey, they did devise a plan on their own. If the Chora frescoes were not influenced by any European fresco technique but evolved on its own, its conservation process was also done by local expertise. They did this. This is the process. We have tried to do it with line drawing because I was part of it, studying it. And first step was to cover the Nayak painting with thin strips of cotton cloth, porous strips. And after that, you put a thicker layer of cloth surrounding it, leaving a free margin of the cloth of around 10 to 15 centimeters on all four sides. You do it with glue, which can be, later the cloth can be easily removed. And then you put a wooden reaper on the top. It had to be done. Why? And also support it with props so that the reaper doesn't fall down. And this was done because when the Nayak painting is being removed from the wall, it is fragile, it's 400 years old, it should not fall down and become powdered towards the end of this complex operation. So a reaper was put, then they started cutting through the Nayak layer. There are two ways of detaching a painted panel from a wall, either without the plaster or with the plaster. And initially they thought they can detach the Nayak painting without its underlying plaster and remount it on fiberglass stands or such other things for museum display, and that would have been a safer bet from the perspective of the Chora painting, which is a priceless heritage. But the Nayak paintings, although 400 years younger than the Chora paintings, they were not done by fresco technique. They were done on dry plaster. They appear to be too brittle to be removed without the underlying plaster. So the more complex process of taking them out with the underlying plaster started, and they started putting a rubber tip mallet and chisel and cutting slowly, and at the same time having an eye on the Chora painting behind it. And if at any point the Chora painting showed brittleness or was getting stuck to the Nayak painting and coming off along with it, The entire operation was suspended till the Chora painting was again consolidated with some chemical injection, and then the process restarted. It was a very slow process involving lot of manpower, and finally once the Nayak painting was removed, it was put upside down on a table and the cloth facing lying on the table. The back of the painting was cleaned, any bulges, anything, and after that it was reinforced with fiberglass stands and aluminum fittings, and after a few days it was turned on the right direction on the table, and the cloth covering it was slowly removed, and finishing touches, any part of the painting was damaged, that was all restored as per international heritage norms, and it was consolidated. And after that, the Chora painting which had been exposed, they were touched up and cleaned. And the initial objective was to where to keep these Nayak paintings. In the same passage inside next to the sanctum, to convey that they were together for centuries, and now thanks to modern technology, we have detached them one from the other so that people enjoy both. But the corridor or the chapels were too narrow to accommodate the Nayak paintings. So they are now kept in a small museum elsewhere in the same temple, and the same museum has huge life-size photographs of the Chora paintings, because unless with special permission or for research purposes, the Chora painting chambers are closed for public now for various reasons. But the conservation process is still on, so the conservators don't want crowds or tourists there. It's too close to the sanctum. The priest doesn't welcome visitors or foreigners, tourists going around the passage. So it's both for religious, traditional, and scientific reasons. This is one of the Nayak paintings in that museum restored. And these are the big life-size Chora paintings in the same museum within the temple. And so this is one of India's greatest case studies of two paintings sticking one with one another, and both of them being detached from each other without any damage to either of them, a feat unparalleled in the whole world. Unfortunately, the Nayak paintings are not as well preserved as the Choras. There are a lot of theories for that. Though they are younger than the Choras, they were done on dry plaster. They bore the brunt of the Anglo-French rivalry, including cannon marks and other deterioration. When water seepage came from the superstructure before the archaeology department intervened, the Nayak paintings bore the brunt. But then they say they sacrificed themselves to preserve the Chora paintings below. And Nayak paintings were not done on fresco techniques, and they have not been properly documented also. There are various issues. Now, the next case study, India has been doing a lot even outside India. The governments in various neighboring countries have been asking India to help with their restoration. And Cambodia, which you all know with its Angkor Wat and adjoining monuments, it is after the Khmer Rouge, which caused a rebel movement which caused a lot of destruction to the monuments. Later peace was restored, and the Cambodian government wanted to preserve and conserve all its priceless treasures, including Angkor Wat. But they neither had the financial resources nor the technical expertise to undertake the gigantic task. They appealed to the international community, and several nations, including France, which was ruling Cambodia at one time, it was a French colony, and many other countries, Germany and many Western countries, came forward to help them. And a small consortium was formed that each country will pool its resources and technical know-how and take up some aspect of the restoration of the entire Angkor region. And India was invited mainly because even the Angkor Wat was built like a Dravidian style South Indian temple. It is a Dravidian style temple dedicated to Vishnu as Ashtabhuja Perumal, and it has Tora and Pallava features. And we do believe there are historical records. Masons and architects travel from the Chora land to Cambodia and they built it. That's why it is having all the South Indian architectural features and sculptures. But around the 15th century, it was converted into a Buddhist shrine. And that Ashtabhuja Perumal's sculpture, a gigantic one, is now kept outside the temple in a small corner. And Lakshmi is also there next to him, but beheaded, unfortunately. And a German team helped restore those two deity sculptures. And so India, since India gave its expertise so many centuries ago to build the Angkor Wat, Indian expertise was now requested to restore the same Angkor Wat. And a big team from the Archaeological Survey went, and a large part of the temple was restored by the Indian team, and other adjoining temples and other parts of the campus were restored by other countries. And even it has been well documented. The archaeologists, 2-3 books have come out of the entire restoration process. And after that, the Indian team is now restoring for the last several years a Buddhist shrine close to Angkor Wat, which is called Ta Pro, and that has certain peculiar problems. It is called Joviria tree temple. The trees or vegetation enters the temple, but now it has come to a stage, they say it's a happy marriage between the tree and the stone, the wood and the stone. Now if you remove the tree, the stone will break. It's the other way around. The tree is supporting the stone. And so the restoration is a very challenging one. It's good for selfies and good picturesque photographs, but it's a challenge for archaeologists, and so it's taking longer than expected. 2008, when I did my initial research in Cambodia, they had started the project. It's still going on. It may take a few more years to get completed. They are removing the tree, but to the minimal extent possible, and consolidating the structure. And in many cases, the structure will remain entwined with the trees, because that appears to be the best remedy in the present circumstance. Next one. Yeah, you can see this is a dramatic photo featured in many places. And now, of course, as I conclude, I would say apart from these, I've given you just a few case studies across the world in which I was closely involved or have done an in-depth study. We have many more. The White House in US, I can do a separate presentation. I had an opportunity to study the history of conservation of the White House itself, the most important monument in US. And within India, Taj has posed several problems with its marble and the refinery close by. It has come to a stage, they say, just like human life, whatever we do at some point, or monuments may also have to break. But like a doctor, we try our best to prolong the life of the monument, or postpone the day when it breaks. But Taj is posing major challenges. It has a long history of conservation, and not many may know the British, among many things they had planned, at one time they thought that Taj is a liability for India, and plans were made to dismantle the Taj and take the marble to London. But then the cost of transporting the marble was prohibitive. That's how we are left with the Taj here today. Humayun tomb in Delhi has also posed major problems. And coming to archaeological excavations, we are using technology, but not as much in the West. It is still mainly labor specific. Of course, digital cameras and digital photography has become common, but digital site reports and computer resident databases and remote sensing and magnetic sensing are there, but not very common. And I would say now and then our ASI or individual archaeologists, we do come to IIT and other scientific institutions to use the lab, take help, and which has been wholeheartedly given. And several research papers of archaeologists have acknowledged the IITs all over the country, including your IIT. And greatest collaboration has been, whether you know it or not, let us hope it takes place in your IIT also. Gandhinagar IIT has a separate distinct department of archaeology, and one of my close friends, Prabhakar, is an associate professor there. Let's hope other IITs also catch up on the same lines. Thank you.